Hi, this is A.T., and this is the late David McGowan. He wrote a book. It was called Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, Laurel Canyon, Covert Ops, and the Heart of the Hippie Dream. He presents a conspiracy theory, well, it's actually a hypothesis that suggests a military intelligence operation that created a new music scene in Southern California, a scene intended to create a cohort of dissolute youth whose antics, lifestyle was so disreputable that the American middle class would, out of spite, give support to continuing the U.S. prosecution of a war in Vietnam, despite its horrendous casualties, despite its high taxes. They did so simply because the hippies were against the war. Put simply, it goes like this. The U.S. government assembled a group of musicians, writers, singers, a great number of whom would come from families associated with work around Washington, D.C., in the military and in intelligence, get them to move to Laurel Canyon outside of Los Angeles, all with government funding, pre-written music. These people would be surrounded then by freaks, who would be later known as hippies, who in turn would attract a growing number of runaways from deracinated families and would all openly rebel against anything that was seen as establishment, in particular the Vietnam War, and thus anger the middle class who'd support continuing the war. Some of you may remember an anti-war activist named Abbie Hoffman. I'm going to quote what he said. There were all these activists, Berkeley radicals, White Panthers, all trying to stop the war and change things for the better. Then we got flooded with all these flower children who were into drugs and sex. Where the hell did all the hippies come from? Well, according to McGowan, they came from a rather private, isolated, self-contained Los Angeles neighborhood called Laurel Canyon. Well, given that, number one, so many future rockers arrived at Laurel Canyon at roughly the same time in early 1965, coming, many of them, from the same areas around Washington, D.C., and they were children of parents who were affiliated with military or intelligence agencies. And given that, number two, Los Angeles and the environment, up to then, were not considered the center of the U.S. music scene. And given that a gigantic government-run movie and sound studio, the Lookout Mountain Laboratory, towered over all those rockers living below in the canyon. Given all these oddities during the beginning of the so-called Summer of Love, can we grant at the very least that McGowan has a legitimate hypothesis, if not a provable conspiracy theory? A hypothesis that suggests government collusion at high levels among military and other intelligence agencies existed in the early and mid-decade of the 60s to create a disreputable opposition to middle-class values, and in particular the war, comprised of drug-fueled rockers and their freak partisans who'd eventually migrate north to San Francisco and elsewhere through the U.S., all the way seducing disaffected youth who would be expected to turn on and tune in and drop out, resulting in middle-class support for the Vietnam War. McGowan does prove that a sizable number of the early rock stars arrived in the canyon at roughly the same time in '65 from common D.C. neighborhoods. They already possessed equipment, maybe pre-written music, perhaps written by government-hired musicians, laboring away above the canyon at the Lookout Mountain Laboratory, where we know now experts were developing cutting-edge new film and sound technologies. McGowan offers the military intelligence bona fides of several of the early rockers and their familiarity with each other Just a few examples. Jim Morrison, the Lizard King. He was lead singer for the group The Doors. He was the son of Admiral William Morrison. Admiral Morrison commanded the U.S. Pacific Naval Fleet during the Vietnam War, and he was in command during the infamous Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, whether or not that incident occurred, that's in question. Not in question is this: that incident led directly to the placement of large numbers of U.S. military forces into combat situations in Vietnam. Morrison was friends growing up in the D.C. area with Gail Sloatman. She became secretary to the owner of the Whiskey A Go-Go outside of Laurel Canyon, and she was married to another Laurel Canyon luminary, Frank Zappa, and she, Sloatman, attended kindergarten with Morrison. Morrison also attended the same Alexandria, Virginia high school as luminaries from the canyon, John Phillips and Cass Elliot of the Mamas and the Papas. Phillips would write the classic song San Francisco that drew so many young people to the Haight District of San Francisco, and then they became hippies. Another example, Lynette Squeaky Fromm. She's a member of the infamous Manson family. Now, they lived outside the canyon, but they spent a lot of time in the canyon, mingling with various luminaries, such as the Beach Boys. Squeaky Fromm later attempted to shoot President Gerald Ford. She came from a military-affiliated family and was childhood friends with Phil Hartman. Now, this is in California. Hartman, you may remember, was a comedian on Saturday Night Live. But in the early days, he was associated with the Rockers, and he painted a number of art albums for Laurel Canyon groups. Now, Hartman, would himself be murdered by his wife, murdered as were too many former or then current residents of Laurel Canyon. Now, Squeaky was also lover of the Doors road manager and a childhood pal of, I think it was Tomark Vollman of the Turtles. Well, the list of acquaintances, many from D.C., from families with government ties, it goes on and on and on. David McGowan's book does not go so far as to identify a provable link between U.S. intelligence and military establishment programs with an artificial music scene with its attendant hippies, but he lays down enough inexplicable coincidences and deaths. Now, many of those deaths are accompanied by very bizarre, unlikely suicides. He offers enough to offer readers a plausible hypothesis. But you may wonder, why deaths of people coming from a military, industrial, intelligence complex? Why kill them when they were put there in Laurel Canyon in the first place? McGowan does not say beyond they maybe knew too much. Well, we cannot ask McGowan about this directly, but he, like so many that he wrote about in his book, died of cancer. He was 55. He died in 2015. It was on, I believe, the 52nd anniversary of John Kennedy's assassination. Epilogue. Pick up a copy of Dr. Mary's Monkey. It's a book written by Ed Haslam and Jim Mars. It shows how intelligence agencies created a cancer-inducing virus. This is E.T. Type in your comments below. Share this video. Hit the thumb up icon. Thank you.